So the history of Unitarian Universalism is that we do come out of the Protestant tradition, the radical edge of the Protestant tradition, so radical that even the Christians don't consider us Christian anymore. And it is one of our sources, our Christianity. Teach us to love our neighbor as ourselves. And it is this time of year particular, many Christian holiday seasons, that we celebrate and look into some of our Christian sources. And so I invite you to adventure into that land. Life sometimes has many adventures if we look for them, sometimes in the simplest of places, engaging with others. So it was once, I would say, a synchronistic occasion upon which some of my childhood friends and I were going on vacation. We had an annual reunion. We went down, we meet in Memphis, Tennessee, just about every year. And we always meet there. And I got to the airport earlier than everyone else, and so I sat around waiting. And while I was waiting, I saw someone holding a sign that said Pagels. Now, this was around 2003, 2004, and I was sort of really into my, just entered seminary and had been deep into my spiritual journey doing extensive readings. And after about 30 seconds of staring at this man holding the sign Pagels, to the point where I thought he might think I was a stalker or something, fighting my introvert tendencies, I went over and asked, is this for Elaine Pagels, the writer? And he said yes, and we chatted for a few minutes, and he then let me know that she was giving a talk that night at a local Episcopal church. So when my friends, 3 of them who were devout Catholics, arrived, well, they're not really that devout, but that's another story. I convinced them that on our first night, instead of going down to Beale Street and partying, that we should go to a church and listen to Elaine Pagels speak. And so, although not a unanimous vote, we did all go, and it was at that time that I first heard about the Gospel of Thomas in a detailed way, and it was really a revolutionary way to think about Christianity. And I received a signed copy of the book, and my friends still to this day never let me forget about it. Although grudgingly, I know they really enjoyed it. So, but I think it is, just in general, an interesting story how we found out about the Gospel of Thomas and some of these other Gnostic Gospels. Our earliest knowing of them comes from the writings of early Christian church leaders condemning them as heretics. And we know that in the year 387, Athanasius, the Bishop of Rome, that's just a word that does not roll off the tongue, issued a decree that demanded all such writings, and I'm quoting here, all such writings except for those specifically listed as acceptable be destroyed, end quote. However, as it turns out, some monks hid some of the writings in the desert. And although we had some scraps of writings here and there, it was not until 1945 when 2 Egyptian brothers who were digging for some soil in the desert came upon this treasure trove of writings. And what these Gnostic Gospels showed was that there was a diversity of early Christianity in the first 2 centuries. It showed how different communities in early Christianity had different understandings of Jesus' teachings. They had different understandings of who Jesus was. They had different understandings even of what God was to them. In learning about the Gospel of Thomas, it also sheds light on some of the other Gospels that we are more familiar with. There are 4 Gospels that are canonical in the Christian tradition: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the synoptic Gospels, meaning that they are similar to each other. And the Gospel of John is a very unique Gospel. It, among the 4 Gospels, focuses much more heavily on the divinity of Jesus rather than the ministry of Jesus. Now, John was written much later than the other three. Maybe most academics believe in the year 80 to 110 CE, about the same dating as the Gospel of Thomas. It was after the beginning of the development of a Christian community. And the Gospel of John was much more anti-Jewish than the other Gospels, which I think just shows the bitterness of the writer that more Jews had not accepted Jesus as the Messiah at that point, and they had to preach to the Gentiles. And now that we have the Gospel of Thomas, it becomes very clear that John and Thomas were two strands of Christianity that were vying with each other for authenticity. And it makes clearer now that we have the Gospel of Thomas, why in the Gospel of John, Thomas is often derided to the point of, without even thinking about it, right, the phrase doubting Thomas has become a part of our lexicon and our vocabulary. The power of long-term marketing, all the way back to the 1st century. The Gospel of John is the only Gospel. There are 3 instances really that really focus on this. The Gospel of John is the only Gospel in which Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. When Jesus tells the disciples that he's going to raise Lazarus, in chapter 11, the disciples say, and I quote, "Rabbi, the Jews were just trying to stone you, and are you going there once again?" And then it is Thomas who says, and I quote, "Let us also go that we may die with him." End quote. Showing that Thomas believes that Jesus is human and that he's going to die in this venture. In John chapter 14, Jesus is anticipating his own death. He tells the disciples, and I quote him, "You know the way to the place where I am going." And it is Thomas who is made to seem ignorant, saying, "Lord, we do not know where you are going. How can we know the way?" End quote. And lastly, in the book of John, when Jesus reappears after his death, and I want to point out that, of course, first he reappears to Mary Magdalene, the woman, and then to all the other disciples except Thomas. And upon telling Thomas, Thomas says, and I quote, "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands and put my finger in the mark of the nails and my hand in his side, I will not believe." End quote. And a week later, Jesus appears to Thomas and says, and I quote, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe." End quote. Now, for millennia, these passages have pushed Christianity into a religion of belief in Jesus as Christ. Now, I've given many sermons on the benefits and the virtue of doubt, and so I will not go there again right now, but today I just want to point out about how much of this storytelling, the creation of these stories, to some degree points to a political divide between two sects in Christianity, that they were written with a very specific purpose in mind, to downgrade the followers of Thomas. We went for almost 2 millennia. Think about it. We went on for almost 2 millennia not hearing one of the stories. And maybe it had to wait 2 millennia, because if it was found 1,000 years earlier, they certainly would have been burned and destroyed. So maybe there was a need to wait 2,000 years. But we went almost 2,000 millennia without instilling the values that the Gospel of Thomas wanted to instill. We went 2 millennia of not teaching the messages of Jesus that the Gospel of Thomas wanted to teach, because less powerful voices were silent. And even if you don't agree with the Gospel of Thomas, it should be heard, just as our message and our values should be heard. We need to be heard so that others who resonate with it will have a place that they can call their religious home, and they don't have to be left in the wilderness, being asked to accept what they do not accept, being asked to believe what they do not believe, being asked to deny who they are. We must be willing to allow our lights to shine for all to see. So the Gospel of Thomas is a collection of 114 sayings attributed to Jesus. They're written in no discernible order, and some of the sayings are similar to the synoptic stories. Others are completely not understandable to my mind, and there are some that are contradictory to each other, just like all the other gospel stories. But the most striking feature, though, in relationship to the Gospel of John, is that it does not promote Jesus as the way. It does at times speak to Jesus as being divine, but it also speaks of the possibility of all human beings having the capability of divinity. It doesn't speak of searching for God or meaning somewhere else, but rather points to a pantheistic view of God in everything and in every person, such as verse 77. He says, and I quote, "Split a piece of wood, and I am there. Lift up a stone, and you will find me there." End quote. It speaks of living in the present moment. Verse 51. What you look forward to has already come, but you do not recognize it. End quote. So we can find eternity and heaven in the here and now, in the present moment. It speaks to finding God, a meaning by looking within, not through rituals or receiving some truth from some otherworldly power, but rather that we all have the light and wisdom within ourselves, waiting to be discovered. In verse 3, Jesus says, if your leaders say to you, look, the kingdom is in heaven, and the birds of the sky will precede you. If they say it is in the water, then the fish will precede you. Rather, the kingdom is inside you and outside you. When you know yourself, then you will be known, and you will understand that you are children of a living God. But if you do not know yourselves, then you will live in poverty, and you are the poverty. End quote. Know thyself, an ancient Greek phrase that predates Jesus. The word Gnostic is based on the Greek word meaning secret knowledge, a way of knowing something intuitively. And intuitively, this last verse actually makes sense to me. If you know yourself, right, you can be comfortable with who you are and not be defensive when others perceive you differently. If you know yourself, it is easier to speak clearly and express your views. If you're comfortable with who you are, there is no need to hide. So you will be known. To be self-aware is an important spiritual goal. To know why we act the way we act, to know what drives us, to know what holds us back, to know why particular people push our buttons and get under our skin. To be self-aware, though just for knowledge, is not enough. With awareness must come action to change where change is necessary, to seek help where help is necessary, and so to seek truth so that we may act in the world in a positive way. If we are not self-aware, we live with certain illusions, we will be lost. If we have to hide who we are, we can never be whole. If we have to hide how we feel, it will eat away at us. But it states that not only will you live in poverty, you are the poverty. That last line, I really had to step back and think about. When we do not let ourselves be known to ourselves or to others, we in some way separate ourselves from others. We create a barrier between ourselves and others. And this causes a breach in our relationships with others. It's often at this point that the ego takes over. For instead of accepting ourselves for who we are, with all of our strengths and weaknesses, We feel a need to prove ourselves right and someone else wrong. And only when we learn to live without fear, without craving, without ego, can we act from a place of knowing. To allow yourself to be known is to risk everything. And sometimes to risk everything can be painful. We all experience pain, but suffering comes from the cravings of our mind. And as the Buddha said in the Four Noble Truths, all of life is suffering, and there is a way out of suffering. And similarly, the Gospel of Thomas speaks to this as well in verse 58. And I quote, "Blessed is the one who has suffered and has found life." End quote. There can be life after suffering. The Gospel of Thomas does have some practical advice about this as well. In verse 8 he says, "The man is like a wise fisherman who cast his net into the sea and drew it up from the sea full of small fish. And among them the wise fisherman found a fine large fish. And he threw all the small fish back into the sea and chose the large fish without difficulty." Just, end quote. Just another way of saying, don't sweat the small stuff, right? Don't get distracted by minor issues, but let's focus on larger issues and opportunities that we have in our lives. And he goes on, I quote, "Do not tell lies, do not do what you hate. Fast as regard to the world, or you will not find the kingdom." End quote. Again, very similar to the Buddhist Eightfold Path, the way out of suffering, where he's speaking of right speech and right vocation. Although I think Jesus goes farther when he says, "Do not do what you hate." Right? I think he's talking about all of our actions, and that all of our actions, as we often say, should be in line with our values. And lastly, to take a Sabbath from the world, to take time to contemplate, to take time away from the hustle and the bustle, to take time to take care of yourself. And in verse 2, "Let one who seeks continue seeking until they find. And when they find, they will become troubled. And when they become troubled, they will be astonished." End quote. Like our fourth principle, the free and responsible search for truth and meaning. Sometimes the truth we find can hurt. It can upset our view of the world and our view of ourselves. But if we are willing to risk being troubled, we will be astonished by what it means to be and to see ourselves and the world clearly. And now I'll leave you with one last line, verse 24. "There is a light within a person of light, and it lights up the whole world. If you remember nothing else from today, remember this. Be a person of light. Go forth and light up the world." May it be so.